I'm trying to get to a kind of truth with compassion and trying to be in the present moment. I think a lot of theater is trying to conjure presence, and I think that is a spiritual practice.
Hello, and welcome to the Metta Hour Podcast with Sharon Salzberg. My name is Lily Cushman, and I produce this podcast. And we're here today with episode 211, and venturing forward, continuing with a series that I may have told you was ending a few weeks ago, but we've decided to continue the real life series here on the podcast. So today's episode is a conversation with the playwright Sarah Ruhl. You may know of Sarah. She has been on the podcast once prior, and this particular interview was part of the Living an Authentic Life Summit that happened a few months ago. And so this interview was on the final day of the summit, which was talking about the qualities that emerge from our life on the path, from living a engaged life with spiritual practice. So this is a really interesting conversation about the way that creativity emerges as kind of a byproduct of our spiritual path. And I'll tell you a little about Sarah. She is an award-winning playwright, American playwright, an author, an essayist, and a professor. Her plays have been on Broadway. They've been across the country, internationally. Her most popular plays are The Clean House, In the Next Room. She's originally from Chicago and received her MFA from Brown. She also won a MacArthur Fellowship in 2006. And she teaches at the Yale School of Drama and lives in Brooklyn. And a lot of this conversation is kind of her journey becoming a writer and this idea of emergence, how the dawning of clarity or beautiful things like creativity and wisdom kind of naturally emerge. It's a lot about creative process and moving from places of contraction into states of creativity. So there's a lot of great stuff in here. But before we get to the episode, a couple of quick announcements. As you may have heard, we have just started another series here on the podcast that is all centered around mental health. In the coming months, we're going to continue to be releasing episodes once a week and alternating between the mental health series and this real life series. So part of why I'm mentioning this mental health series is because we would love to hear from you. If you have any topics in that arena, what we're exploring in the series is really the way that spiritual practice, whether it's Buddhist philosophy or meditation practice, how that can support mental health, and also really just working to destigmatize mental health. So as part of that, we are open to your topic suggestions, or if you have any particular questions, you can shoot us an email to admin@sharonsalzberg.com. That's ADMIN@sharonsalzberg.com. Also, I want to point you to the resource list that we're putting together as part of that series, which has a pretty big variety of resources, things like how to find a therapist who's trained in mindfulness. So you can find that at sharonsalzberg.com. And yes, please reach out if you have mental health topics that you'd like to hear included in the series. So let's get into today's episode, the real life series with Sharon Salzberg and Sarah Ruhl.
am Sharon Salzberg, and welcome back to the Summit. Today is the final day of the Summit, and we're exploring the emergence of the many good things that come from our path, including creativity. I'm joined by award-winning American playwright, author, essayist, and professor Sarah Ruhl. Sarah's plays have been produced on Broadway and across the country, as well as internationally, and translated into 14 languages. Among her most popular plays are Eurydice, 2003, The Clean House, 2004, and In the Next Room, 2009. Originally from Chicago, she received her MFA from Brown University, where she studied with Paula Vogel. She is the recipient of a Helen Merrill Emerging Playwrights Award, a Whiting Writers Award, a Penn Center Award for Mid-Career Playwrights, a Steinberg Distinguished Playwright Award, and a Lilly Award. She's a member of 13P and New Dramatists and won the MacArthur Fellowship in 2006. She teaches at Yale School of Drama and lives in Brooklyn with her family. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's such an honor to be here and get to talk to you. It's such a privilege.
Well, thank you. I mean, you're such an incredible playwright and author, and I'm delighted to chat with you today about your work and your creative process. And as you know, I'm a deep lover of theater as an art form. It's been a while since I've been in the theater. And as I've shared with you before, and listeners of my podcast, The Metta Hour, know, when I was a child, my dream profession actually was to be a playwright. So when I got asked that question, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'd say a playwright.
It's not too late. I really want to see a play by you.
Thank you very much. Well, I've discussed my problems, my issues, which is, first of all, I don't know how to write a play, but more deeply, I don't really know the story. There's not something I'm on fire to tell, but I feel if I find it, and sometimes I think I may have, then I'll learn how to write a play.
Exactly. Yeah. A play is really nothing more than conversation with a little story running underneath. So you're brilliant at conversation. So I'm sure.
Well, thank you.
Pick it up in a day.
There's something about it, plus the deeply collaborative nature of the form, which is also challenging, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That I just moved to do it. So
yeah.
So our theme in the summit today is centered on the idea of emergence. How with the dawning of clarity, kind of seeing things more as they are, not as we've maybe held them to be or been taught they were. Like beautiful things like creativity and wisdom emerge. So it's not this kind of like determined process, like I'm going to get wisdom or I'm going to be boldly creative. It just happens. It comes out of us because we've just put our body, mind, our being in a position where it's almost like inevitable. This is what needs to emerge. So I want to talk to you more about your creative process and how do you experience a shift from when we're most contracted, most held in, most feeling I can't do it, to actually doing it.
I love the word emergence to talk about writing. And some of my most amazing teachers, I think, have taught me that, even though it's not in the guise of Buddhism, but is more in the guise of improvisation. So I had one teacher, Maria Irene Fornes, who I studied with in Mexico, and she would always say, don't treat your characters like little puppets. Don't tell them what to do. Don't kind of manipulate them. Let them speak, which is a form of emergence and a form of listening, really. I think we can feel trapped when we're writing if we think it all has to come out of us, as opposed to listening to what is emerging from us. And it's a fine distinction, but I do think writers are often wonderful listeners. Most of the writers I love the best are better listeners than they are talkers. Although, of course, there's some writers who are also great talkers. But the poets I really love and the playwrights I really love have that quality of deep listening where I know they're also listening to their characters. And I think it also comes from a place of play and playing with, too, in the theater. What's between you and your collaborator? What's between two actors? that's also where things start to emerge. So the idea that you're not just one lonely self trying to spew forth, but you're engaging in the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. There's you and there's me and there's the space between, and is what is born in that space.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that's wonderful and weird about playwriting is that a lot of writers are comfortable with isolation, but not necessarily comfortable playing in a room. So I think with playwriting, you have to have the social self with all of the beauty of collaboration and all the pain of collaboration, and also being content to sit in a room for 24 hours and doing your writing.
Well, when I was writing this book, Faith, and struggling quite a bit with it, I talked to this writing coach and great writer, Susan Griffin, and she said to me, "You've got to stop thinking of yourself as the person who's writing this book and start thinking of yourself as the first person who gets to read this book," which was perfect, because especially as I undertake topics that feel ponderous, or deep or important or meaningful, I kind of get, my writing gets worse, and I get and more elevated and
Right.
it's like highfalutin. It's like, get down, just say it. And I always need reminders, just get down, just be here in some way.
That's so beautiful. I suspect that would be really hard, feeling like people are looking to you for wisdom. With playwriting, writing something really, really dumb is sometimes the answer. People aren't necessarily looking to you for wisdom, even though I guess some wisdom can come out of something seemingly really dumb.
Well, do you find that the act of writing for you is a kind of spiritual practice, like getting out of the way, things like that?
It is more and more and more and more consciously. I think it always has been holy to me since I was even a kid and writing a poem here and there. And I remember when I wrote one of my first plays, Eurydice, which is a play about the Orpheus myth told from Eurydice's point of view. And my aunt came to see it, and she's a Tibetan Buddhist, and she said, "Oh, there's so much Dharma in here, and there's so much Bardo in here," and I didn't know what she was talking about at all. It took me years to understand what she was talking about. But I think teaching is holy to me. Teaching is a spiritual practice to me, and writing is insofar as we are trying to get to a kind of truthful. When I'm using the royal we, I don't know why. I guess I should own it. I'm trying to get to a kind of truth with compassion and trying to be in the present moment. I think a lot of theater is trying to conjure presence, and I think that is a spiritual practice.
Interesting. And I found your book of pandemic poetry, by the way, Love Poems in Quarantine. So compelling. That first year of quarantine, or lockdown, I think is the technical term. Since I was never ill, but I was not in quarantine per se, but everyone calls it quarantine, so I understand. When the world as we knew it just seemed to stop, it just offered this odd sense of spaciousness and shrinking. For many of us, time was just immeasurable, while our social world, our sense of context, shrank down to just squares in a Zoom call. And I'm wondering how you were tapping into your creative spirit during such a challenging time. I wrote 2 books during that time. Did you have specific activities or practices you did that helped connect you with a creative flow?
Yes, a couple things. One was I did through the Zen Center. They had a kind of meditation a day program, which was great on Zoom. And then the more I was meditating every day, I started writing a haiku a day, and that's what led to Love Poems in Quarantine. And I think it was also the fact that I was out of the city for some of the lockdown, and I hadn't been as close an observer of the seasons changing. when I live in Brooklyn. And I think because culture, theater and culture and being in the dark with other people is usually my form of art making. Suddenly nature was there and it was all the culture I needed. It had all the transformation I needed. It had all the novelty I needed. And so I felt actually really happy to be present with those changes that I was seeing out my window. And I was not writing plays. I couldn't for the life of me write a play. I felt so sad that my art form was shuttered, and it just seemed strange to imagine myself back into a rehearsal room instead of where I was, which was staring out the window at, leaves changing.
Yeah, I mean, all expectations, and for some people, their sense of who they are and what they did, it was really shattered. I went right into teaching on Zoom, and
Mm-hmm.
it was, it was fine. And I think partly from my life of writing, that part of me, I felt a very strong, I feel a very strong connection when even if I can't see a person, if I can't see their face, a
Mm-hmm.
little square, um, I just know they're out there and that we're connecting
Mm-hmm.
and that we're both here in a very full way. And I know
Mm-hmm.
other teachers, of course, and presenters who it's very, very hard. They feel like they're talking to nobody. But um,
Mm-hmm.
I really felt tremendous connection with a lot of people throughout that time. Um, and yet, there was all that uncertainty. And for other people, like theater people, um, when will it come back? Will it come back?
Mm-hmm.
What's coming
Yeah.
back? And it was tremendous upheaval.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel like you were, in a way, you'd prepared all your life for lockdown
Yeah,
because you'd been meditating
yeah, totally.
all your
Like,
life? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, and people said to me, you've been getting ready for this your whole life, and I thought, well, yeah, it's actually true. I'm used to silence, at the times, and
mm-hmm.
it's not that I saw nobody, but I'm used to finding that sense of connection even without kind of socializing
Yeah.
and resting with it and feeling the profundity of it and the beauty of it. So I didn't feel so much, oh, I'm lacking
Mm-hmm.
connection, but it's different. It's so different. Like I came up here to Barre, Massachusetts, where I am right now, from New York City, thinking I was coming up for 2 weeks. I can even remember the moment. I thought I'll just
Yeah.
go up there for 2 weeks and ride it out. So I came up here in March of 2020, and April,
Yeah.
May, June, July,
Yeah. I felt similarly when I was teaching. I felt that the intention of people to be present was as good in some ways as being present, but I felt so bad for the students because I felt like while some people I knew had been meditating their whole life to get to the place where they could be alone for that period of time, I thought these 22-year-olds have no
yeah,
practice
yeah.
being in this deep isolation. It must have been so shocking, and really the resilience of the species during that time is astonishing looking back at it.
So the first year, and then of course there was like the second year and the third year.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering, again about specific activities or practices. Like I found myself in my meditation practice, I went right back to the beginning and I was just with my breath, like the simplest of foundational exercises. And of course, loving
Mm-hmm.
kindness. I used to really relish practicing loving kindness meditation, walking down the streets of New York or sitting on an airplane and sitting in the subway. It's all gone,
Mm-hmm.
so remembering to hold people in my heart and finding out, that in the beginning, it was different than as things evolved, in the culture in general, where there's a quality of caring that emerged, and it was very beautiful. Being
Mm-hmm.
so connected to people in New York, I heard a lot of New York stories, and there
Mm-hmm.
were, the person would say to me, "I've lived in this apartment for 12 years. I never even knew my neighbors' names, and now we all
Mm-hmm.
have one another's phone numbers, and we're checking in on
Yeah.
each other." And it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember the first time I touched someone's hand casually after the lockdown, on Montague Street in Brooklyn, where I buy my dog food. I remember the first time buying my dog food in person and exchanging money, and our hands touched when he gave me change, and he said something like, "Here's your change, my friend." And I just felt like weeping because all of those casual interactions with strangers hadn't been happening.
Yeah. So in 2021, right in the midst of everything, you published a memoir, Smile, about your experience with Bell's palsy, which is a form of sudden facial paralysis that for 90% of people, it dissipates on its own. But for you, it did not. So can you tell us what moved you to share your story and how sharing it offered you a doorway to healing?
Sure. It was hard for me to come to the decision to write about it. And partly it was my husband suggested it because he said, you write about what you're thinking about and what makes you suffer. And this is the thing you've been thinking about, suffering about. And so I sort of tried, and it started pouring out of me. And I realized that I hadn't made any sense of it for myself because I never talked about it. It was sort of written on my face, but I had no control of the narrative. So it was quite literally healing for me, because the crazy story is, once it came into the world, this doctor called me and said, "I actually think you have neurological Lyme disease. That's why you're not getting better." And he called me out of the blue, and I was so shocked. And I thought, no, that can't be. I was tested for Lyme 11 years ago. Well, 50% of the tests are, it doesn't show up. And in fact, we'd been in Long Island when I was pregnant, and my husband had gotten a bullseye rash, and it was not long after that I got Bell's palsy. So I'm just finally now getting treated for that. And I thought it was this crazy story about the healing power of literature, but in this sense, it was like the writer getting healed, by a reader. So I feel very grateful.
No, that's amazing. And in a way, it's not entirely surprising that in your examination and the act of sharing your experience of the suffering, so much more healing was possible.
Yeah.
It's really kind of amazing just to contemplate that.
Yeah.
Can you say some more about the importance and benefit of the collective sharing of suffering?
Yes, I think that there's so much shame attached to suffering sometimes, and we're not even aware there's shame until we speak about the suffering. It wouldn't have occurred to me that I felt ashamed of Bell's palsy, because logically there's no reason for it. It's just something my body did. But once I started talking about it, I realized I did have a great deal of shame about not getting better or not being able to express myself. And then once I expressed it, all these people reached out to me and back to me. And sometimes it was a stranger saying, "Oh, yes, I too had Bell's palsy. The experience was more painful than childbirth. I just hid in a closet for, 3 weeks." Other people who I was close with would tell me stories of how, "Oh, I have this tic, and when I'm on stage, I always try to face upstage if I have to eat, because my eye closes when I eat, and I'm really ashamed of it." And I thought, and I've never told anyone that. And I thought, my God, I never would have known. I do not judge you for it. And I was so surprised he had shame around it. So I do think speaking it out loud can take some power away from it. And it's also that, what do they call it? Tend and befriend. The opposite of fight or flight.
Yeah.
Tend and befriend.
Yeah.
I think that kind of connection that can get made through our imperfections and our suffering is really profound. It's like with social media, we think we're connecting through images of perfection. Actually, that makes people feel alienated and isolated. But sharing our fragility, I think, really invites care.
Well, the tragedy of our conditioning is often that, we add insult to injury, in effect, that we hurt about something, physically, emotionally, somehow. And then on top of that, we have the sense of permanence. This is the only thing I will ever feel forever. Or I'm not okay. I should have been able to stop this. I should have been able to control this. Or
Mhm.
maybe most corrosively, I am the only one. I'm the
Mhm.
only one. And there is such tremendous transformation that happens simply knowing that's not true. And it's not like misery loves company either. There's something so awful in feeling you are the only one.
Mhm.
And not only do you feel aberrant, you're different, you don't measure up, but it's so lonely, and so like, what do you do with all this feeling?
Mhm.
And yet, even just understanding we're not alone is such a
Mhm.
powerful bridge right there.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so woven through your incredible teachings, and
Oh, thank you.
I just feel comforted just hearing you say those words. I feel
Mm.
delighted.
Yeah, because we're never alone. It's the myth that
Mhm.
surrounds our lives. And I'm also
Mhm.
thinking of listening to my friend Bob Thurman, who up until recently was a professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia University, and he lost his eye when he was very young. He must have been like somewhere between 18 and 20, something like that. And he was underneath a car when the jack slipped and the car fell on his
Mm.
eye and on his head, and
God,
he lost his eye. And
oh my God.
not long after that, he became connected to this actually Mongolian Lama teaching Tibetan Buddhism um, in New Jersey. And he became his first teacher, and his teacher, Geshe Wangyal, was the teacher of many of the early scholars of Tibetan Buddhism, the translators, and so on. And um, Bob once quoted Geshe Wangyal to me about the loss of his eye, and this was when I had written the book Faith and had talked a tremendous amount about my own childhood suffering and trauma in that book. And so Bob read the book, and then he quoted Geshe Wangyal to me, which was, "You should never be ashamed of your suffering."
Mm.
He said, "You lost an eye, but you gained 1,000 eyes of wisdom."
So
So
beautiful.
yeah, it was very beautiful because we are.
Oh.
It's kind of a very odd thing of emotional
Mhm.
baggage that we carry.
Mhm. It reminds me too of Alice Walker. I guess I can't remember what happened to her eye, but one of her eyes is either clouded over or is a glass eye. And there's a beautiful passage in one of her books about how she was worried about her daughter noticing the imperfection of her eye for the first time. And instead, when her daughter pointed at the eye, she said, "Oh, Mom, I can see the whole world in that eye. It's like a planet."
Mm,
This this feeling that other people will judge us, and sometimes from these unlikely places we'll get complete unconditional love where we least expect it.
that was fun for me in writing this most recent book, Real Life. Kind of seeing the range of practices that are all basically saying exactly what you just said, and how we each find our own expression of that that's meaningful to us. And
Mhm.
from one of my Tibetan teachers has this practice called handshake practice, which is like a very primary kind of mindfulness. It's like what arises within, he calls beautiful monsters. This is
Mm.
Sonny Rinpoche is his name. And what do? You shake their hand. You don't like try to
Mm.
pulverize them. You don't try to annihilate them. You don't absorb them so that you're taken over either. It's
Mhm.
like, here I am, it's like a friend, but a friend who's like a little older and kind of with it and in charge,
Mhm.
like, okay, here we are, let's hang out. It's okay. We don't have
Yeah,
to be
I
so
love that.
afraid and so
Mhm.
on. And, from that to, Dan Siegel talking about the window of tolerance, like what is the range of feeling, of emotion, of physical sensation, anything that we can tolerate before clinging or condemning, in other words. And how do we widen that so
Mhm.
that we can be that present with so many different things, and even just bringing in the suffering so that uh, you don't feel so different and other people don't have to think they're so different is very important.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's so beautiful. I want to go shake a monster's hand immediately.
beautiful monster.
I have so many.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
So, one of the many techniques that's used in different meditation practices is naming and investigating what's present. So, I think even in current Western psychology, there's some phrase like, we name it to tame it. Like not to go crazy as a word person, which I used to do. Like I used to sit there in India in my meditation thinking, is this pain or is this discomfort or is it something in between? So it was like a complete waste of time and basically resembled somebody sitting down and reading a thesaurus. So, you don't have to do that, but there's some way of just saying, it's anger, it's not my anger. It's not forever anger. It's not that horrible state anger. It's like, it's anger. And it brings us into a different relationship with what is. And in some ways, the magic of writing as well and creating has to do with relationship. How does one thing relate to the next? How does one person relate to the next in what I am creating? And seeing it that way actually helped me a lot as well. That they're patterns, they're processes that we miss because we're so upset, when we can actually pay more attention in a simpler way, then we get to see it. And it's very different.
And is it better to say it's anger as opposed to I'm angry? To take the I out? Is that labeling helpful?
I mean, it just depends. I think it depends on where you feel out of balance, if it's like nearly unbearable to say I'm angry, that's interesting, but more in terms of, I think, that ultimate right relationship, it would be like, there is anger, we're not denying that we feel it and we shouldn't deny it. And we're not trying to push it away, but the difference is, one psychologist pointed out to me once, the difference between saying I am angry and I feel anger is an important distinction.
Yeah.
Because when I am angry, then I am. It's like the totality of my being. When I feel something, that's what I feel. And what am I going to do about it? Maybe the next question. So it's more kind of along the lines of that relationship.
Do other languages have a different relationship to the emotions? So they don't say I am angry, but there is anger?
Well, certainly in practice, I don't know about language per se, but although, in Tibetan, there's no word for emotion. What does that mean? The word for heart and the word for mind are famously the same word in Asian languages, Tibetan, Chinese, and Sanskrit, and so on. And that's always fun, because seeing a Western person with our dichotomy, our split, which is a construct, it's not inherent. And it's not the way an Asian person through language would see the world. But watching a Western person approaching let's say a Tibetan teacher and saying, I have to get out of my mind into my heart. And what you just said to them is, I have to get out of my heart into my heart, or out of my mind into my mind. And it makes no sense.
God, I love it. I did not know that. So to translate mindfulness, even the choice of that, is it really heartfulness or mind heartfulness?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and that's implicit. And part of our problem in translation, and I don't know if you even feel this in translating ordinary activity into some creative medium, is what we know deeply and is implicit in that translation maybe needs to be explicit for other people. So I began my meditation practice in 1971 in January, and the word mindfulness always had layers of meaning to it, of heartfulness and kindness and not giving yourself such a hard time as usual, and so on. And it's only been more recently, as the word has gotten so popular, that I hear people saying, well, it's a cold word. It's really like clinical. Maybe we should call it warm mindfulness, or we should call it kindfulness, or heartfulness, or and I just call it mindfulness because that is what I'm used to, and that I know what that means.
What is the word in Tibetan?
For mindfulness?
Yeah.
I don't know about mindfulness. The word in Sanskrit for mindfulness is sati,
Right.
S-A-T-I.
Right. Huh.
And the word for heart and mind is chitta, C-I-T-T-A.
Right. I'm so lucky. I get a teaching with you tonight.
I feel lucky. We can talk about being a playwright. I want to study with Paula Vogel.
You should. She would love you. I mean, yeah, she does these boot camps from time to time. I'll let you know if one happens.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be great. I was teaching once not at the Yale School of Drama. This was also on Zoom, which has come up lately, and it's just fascinating to me to see how a mode of creativity like that can encompass so much awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what you're doing, is you're evoking a whole world.
Mm-hmm. When I know you talked once to Lynn Nottage, right, at the Signature Theater.
Yeah.
I know Lynn, and I'm working right now at Signature Theater, actually, on a play that should have been done during the pandemic, but now I'm finally rehearsing about my former student, Max Ritvo, who was a wonderful poet, who also was always thinking about mindfulness and meditation and poetry as a spiritual practice. So it seems fitting that I get to talk to you just as I'm going into tech for that play.
It's so great. So do you find that in writing, the act of naming some taboo topics, painful topics, has an impact in disarming them for you and your audience?
I do. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind with that is shame around sex, because I wrote a play called In the Next Room, or the Vibrator Play. And even just having, this was, I guess, 15 years ago or so, but having the audience have to call and ask for tickets to the Vibrator Play was probably deeply uncomfortable for some people. And I have a friend, Bruce Norris, who's a playwright, who I think really each of his plays sort of lances a boil of shame and nastiness in our culture. So I think there are different ways to do it. I mean, there are ways to gently name. There are, surgical excavations. There are boil lancings. There's so many different ways to name something that's unnameable in the culture. And sometimes I feel like theater will pretend to excavate an issue that's sort of a hot topic, hot button issue in our culture. But actually it doesn't. It just makes you think as though you thought about it, but it's not experiential. Mm-hmm. And I guess my favorite kind of theater feels more like an enactment, more like a ritual, more like you're partaking somehow.
I think something that sentence that kind of encapsulates my hopes and aspirations of myself as a writer. It was actually Tommy Kail, who directed Hamilton, where he said something like, in some interview, he said, "Everything in our play seems inevitable and none of it was." And I thought, that's what I want. I want to look at a house and not think, God, that architect had some amazing conceited ideas, Or look at that flourish, that architect. I just want to feel like it grew there. It's inevitable. It's natural. Oh, that's how it is. Of course, that's how it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do feel like one is aiming for kind of simplicity and apparent effortless quality. And, you look at an Elizabeth Bishop poem like The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master, and it's like a palimpsest. If you look at all the drafts, and it seems completely inevitable with the rhymes, but there was so much effort that went into making it look effortless. So I also think about that question of sort of right effort, that there's the grace that pours in artistically or can, but you can't just sit there and conjure it. You have to plunk your butt in a chair and do the work of it. and then unbidden in these little pockets of grace, some little fairy will seem to do the writing for you. Or I joke that my dog is writing for me, my dog Minerva, because she comes and sits at my feet. So my kids always think, oh, Minerva's writing her emails now, Mom.
That's so sweet.
But taking the I out of it, in a way, taking the ego out of it.
Yeah, and that's part of what I really loved about that concept of wisdom, because the ego is also, it becomes something we hold more lightly, and so then there's just space, and there's some possibility of very new things emerging, which is great.
Mm-hmm. And I think, for theater students, talking about collaboration, holding the ego lightly is essential and not always easy.
I would imagine not, and no lack of desire to blame, like.
Yeah.
If you hadn't dressed them that way, it would have been a huge success.
Yes.
What led you to your interest in meditation? I'm so curious.
I'm trying to remember the timing of it. When did I first become interested? I think the interest probably started with yoga a long time ago, and that was a little portal in. My husband is also half Thai, half Australian, and so he was kind of born into some meditative practices. And too, it's funny that we talked about Maria Irene Fornes, one of my teachers, who would have us meditate and visualize before writing. And I think Irene came to it through yoga as well, and not through any kind of defined spiritual practice. But she was always more about attention. How can you visualize? How can you see? How can you focus your attention? And it's really the same thing.
I once was sitting in the room in the audience when the Dalai Lama was on a panel at Emory University, and the panel was sponsored by the art department, so it was about creativity. And it was Alice Walker and Richard Gere and the Dalai Lama, and the question came up. It was the first question, and it's the question I'm so often asked about, does great art have to come out of great suffering? And they were all interesting. Alice Walker said that her early teachers believed that, and so she used to believe that, but she felt the happier she got, the better her poetry got. And Richard talked about being an angry young man. And then the Dalai Lama, there's just a certain look he gets on his face when the conversation is like, what? Really? And so he said, people are always taking me places and pointing at things, like a painting and a piece of architecture, something, and saying, isn't it beautiful? Isn't it wonderful? And he said, in Tibet, we have a belief that the worth or the beauty of a piece of art depends on what happened to the creator in the process. Like, did they get kinder? Did they get more aware? Did they get more present? Then it's a beautiful piece of art. And I was thinking, we don't think that way, really, do we?
That's so beautiful. How is the artist changed by making the art? Yeah, the idea that art only comes through great suffering really neglects joy and really neglects the concept of play and playfulness, which is a very joyful thing. And I think the kind of confessional mode of telling your trauma on the page being the only kind of authentic way to make art really leaves out the spirit of play, which again is in dialogue with other people. The tragic impulse, I think, is more solipsistic, and play and humor, I think, are wonderful correctives. And I always think it's amazing how funny the Dalai Lama is too. You know, how there's always a smile and a twinkle. And I think sometimes people don't, you know, it's like comedy never wins the Oscar because it's not serious. It's not suffering. It's less artful. But I think comedy can be so artful and so wise because it creates a gap between the suffering and the person doing the suffering. So to me, that gap is kind of wonderful. In tragedy, the gap closes, and you know, everybody's suffering together. But I do think that catharsis, that idea of suffering together, you know, you're not the only one suffering. That's to me what makes it artful. To be in a kind of ritual space where communally we're acknowledging that everybody suffers.
That's wonderful. So here we are in another era, so to speak. You're taking medication for the Lyme disease. You've got.
It's my first day. I have my my little. I did my port myself.
Oh.
See, I have my IV antibiotics. My first day, so I feel like it's a good sign that I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
It's like medicine Buddha day.
Wow, that's amazing. I will do lots and lots of loving kindness for you. Really.
Oh, thank you.
It's odd, I'm sure, to have a diagnosis where the hardest thing of all is kind of getting the diagnosis. Yeah.
It's so crazy. I mean, I won't go into a rant about Lyme and the medical establishment, but it's bizarre. I mean, it's like a war right now. I was just lucky. I finally went to Stony Brook and they gave me a spinal tap, and there it was. But it was really hard to find for a long time. But yeah, and there's maybe a deeper thing you're pointing at about the length of time to get a diagnosis. I mean, I don't know what to say about it. I had some rage at first when I finally got a diagnosis because it took so long to get one. But I allowed myself, I hope 3 days of rage and then went on to some gratitude that I finally have a diagnosis.
See, now I'm stuck in playwright mode, wishful thinking, like 3 days of rage. That's a title for something. That could be a play. What would it look like?
It's not a bad title. Is it already a movie or something? 3 Days of Rage? Maybe I should read 3 Days of Rage.
That's a good one.
Well, I had decided at one point that the plays that win Tony Awards have to have a scene of men yelling at each other. It's like almost disqualifying to not. So then I was going to write a play called Men Yelling at Men, but I didn't know what they'd be yelling about. 3 Days of Rage.
Well, the Tony Awards this year, this is kind of landing this whole conversation in a certain time. And of course, it's hopefully timeless as well. But the Tony Awards this year in 2023 are going to be up in Washington Heights at the theater that was my childhood movie theater.
No kidding.
And I went in one of my returns to New York. It was one of the very few events I've been to in 3 years, which was a moth reading, you know, storytelling organization. And it was like in the lobby, and it was only like 30 people, and everyone had to wear a mask, and, you know, so I felt that, you know, I could go, and I went, and it was incredible. And I was looking at this is in the lobby, it's a very ornate theater. I was looking at the walls, and they're like all these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And I called over somebody from the theater, and I said, "Is that the Buddha?" And they didn't know, you know. But I thought, God, I grew up with this, you know, like
how funny.
Like this was my movie theater.
Yeah.
And so if you go to the Tonys, look at the walls in the lobby. I'm
so curious now. Why? Like, what would have been happening at that time that muralist would have painted that?
Yeah, I think it's like Baroque. I don't know. It's like some stylistic thing, you know. Let's have a golden cherub, except it's the Buddha.
Oh, I didn't even know. And so no more Radio City Music Hall this year. That's great.
Not this year. I don't know, you know.
Yeah.
But I just thought, gosh, that's so incredible.
Yeah. surrounded by bodhisattvas from a young age. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's that little being?
Yeah.
That's a Buddha. So may it be a blessed time for you with lots of movement and possibility being actualized and creativity flowing.
Well, thank you, and you too. It's really, you give people so much liquid gold in your teachings, and I'm so grateful to be one of the recipients, and
thank you.
Yeah, so honored to be in dialogue with you, and I'm sure your book will bring more people more happiness, which is a good thing. Did you want me to read a poem? But
I do. I was going to say I would love it if you could leave us with a poem from Love Poems in Quarantine, the name of which I got wrong earlier, that might speak to the possibility of creativity, even amidst our most challenging times.
Maybe I'll read a tiny haiku, because haiku are so short. And then I'll read a poem about laundry. Crossing. The water rushes and it doesn't stop rushing. We help each other cross. And then I felt like I was doing laundry all the time during quarantine, even though I don't know why there'd be more laundry, but what we are folding when we're folding laundry in quarantine. Standing 4 feet apart, you take one edge of the sheet, I take the other. We walk toward one another, creating order. Like solemn campers folding a flag in the early morning light. But this is no flag, this is where we love and sleep. There was a time we forgot to do this, to fold with and toward one another, to make the edges clean together. My grandmother might have said, there is always more laundry to do, and that is a blessing because it means you did more living, which means you get to do more cleaning. We forgot for a while that one large blanket is too difficult for one chin to hold and 2 hands to fold alone. That there is more beauty in the walking toward the fold and in the shared labor.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. And as always, it's really such a pleasure to share time with you and learn about your experience of creativity. And you've inspired me to go on and, check out new pathways.
Well, likewise. And if I get a +1 to the Tony Awards ever, I'm going to bring you.
To learn more about Sarah's incredible library of work, you can visit her website, which is Sarah Ruhl Playwright. It's SARAHRUHL playwright.com.
Hey folks, thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Sharon's different offerings, her different virtual teachings, online courses, or to get a copy of her new book, Real Life, you can visit SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour Podcast on the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.